I sat on the bench of the Providence Court on a heavy morning, when the case file from Federal Hill, the neighborhood still bearing the traces of historical shadows in Providence, Rhode Island, was brought before me. What seemed like a simple traffic collision, but the severity of the injuries and the identity of the person behind the wheel had caused the entire city to pause and follow it. The victim, Mr. Luca Romano, 58 years old, owner of a small grocery store, was the kind of person every community needs: hardworking, honest, trying to support his family with decency in a neighborhood that wasn't always peaceful. Facing him was the defendant, Valentina Moretti, 23 years old, daughter of Vittorio, the Hawk Moretti, a name that when spoken was enough to silence all of Federal Hill. The contrast between the two people was almost drawn with too bold a stroke: a vulnerable victim who maintained his full dignity, and a defendant born into privilege, raised in underground power, accustomed to crossing every boundary without ever having to pay a price. According to the police report and witness statements, Valentina had been driving her bright red Ferrari at a speed far exceeding the limit on Atwells Avenue. Annoyed at seeing Mr. Romano's car going slowly, she deliberately forced his vehicle onto the sidewalk as an act of intimidation. Her bodyguard immediately stepped out, coldly warning the onlookers, "Mind your business if you want to stay alive." Many witnesses confirmed they heard Valentina say, "My father owns this street," and when someone tried to call the police, she casually replied, "Call whoever you want, nothing will happen." But this time things did not unfold according to the script she was familiar with. Traffic cameras captured the entire forcing maneuver. Officer Daniel's body cam recorded her full defiant attitude and threats. Local media immediately jumped in, raising questions about whether the rule of law in Rhode Island was strong enough to confront a name like Moretti. Public pressure built up increasingly, and it was precisely that which forced this case to be tried publicly before me today. The courtroom doors opened, and Valentina Moretti entered as if the room belonged to her. Two bodyguards in black suits followed closely behind, not overly flashy but enough for everyone in the gallery to know they weren't there out of courtesy. Valentina didn't look at anyone except the phone screen in her hand, walking leisurely, each step slow as if she were entering a fashion show rather than a trial involving serious injuries she had caused. As soon as she sat at the defense table, she immediately crossed her legs, placed her expensive bag on the table, and continued texting, not bothering to look up when the court clerk read the charges again. I observed her exchanging words with her lawyer in a tone not of someone needing defense, but of someone giving orders, as if she were a customer in a luxury restaurant and the lawyer was merely a waiter. She didn't once glance toward Mr. Romano, showing no sign of awareness of the consequences of her actions. Even when his name was mentioned, Valentina only glanced over with a cold and empty look, as if he didn't exist. The courtroom grew tense in a way I'd become familiar with over many years as a judge, but this time there was something different: fear. Not fear of the case, but fear of the name Moretti. A few witnesses I had met before the trial looked down at the floor, avoiding Valentina's gaze as if a single look from her could cause them trouble. The people in the gallery sat straighter than usual, trying to appear calm, but their faces said otherwise. No one wanted to become a target of the Moretti family. Even the police present kept a stiffer distance than normal, their vigilance evident in every movement. I had seen many types of defendants: angry, remorseful, desperate, fearful, but in Valentina there wasn't a single sign of genuine emotion, only boundless confidence, the kind nurtured over years of living in power without ever encountering boundaries. That attitude wasn't new to me, but the level of brazenness was rare. I recognized it clearly. Valentina didn't just think she would escape all responsibility. She believed that having to appear here was an insult to her status. In her eyes, the law was a pastime for the weak, and that was the most dangerous sign when someone born into criminal privilege believes that justice is something that can be bent by their family name. I asked the defendant to stand, and Valentina looked up from her phone screen with an expression as if I had just interrupted a luxurious vacation. She sighed, stood up slowly, her eyes not bothering to hide her annoyance. I asked if she understood the seriousness of her actions, and that was the moment everything in the courtroom changed. Valentina smirked, the kind of smile from someone who had lived her whole life believing the world was her personal property, then said in a light voice as if commenting on a designer item, "I don't spend under $100K a day, that's your yearly salary." The statement landed in the room like a ton of bricks. Everything froze. The court clerk's keyboard typing stopped abruptly. A few people in the gallery gasped. One witness unconsciously gripped the sleeve of the person next to them. Valentina's lawyer turned pale and whispered desperately, "Valentina, please," but she completely ignored him. Even the two bodyguards standing behind shifted slightly, as if they too understood that the door she had just opened was not one any wise person would want to enter. I looked straight at Valentina, and in that moment, she decided to escalate the defiance to a higher level. Without another word, Valentina reached into her bag, pulled out an Amex Centurion card, the black card that the world's richest use as a symbol of power, and tossed it onto my bench. The card slid a short distance across the wood and stopped right next to the gavel, like a declaration that she considered the law cheaper than the things she threw away every day. A small "oh" escaped. Then the courtroom fell into absolute silence. No one moved. No one dared breathe heavily. I kept looking at Valentina, not angrily, not loudly, because sometimes silence is the strongest response to arrogance. "Miss Moretti," I said, my voice even and sharp, "you may be accustomed to using money to decide everything in your life, but in this courtroom your credit card has no value whatsoever." She shrugged, still maintaining her defiant expression, as if my words were just noise. I continued, "And what you just did doesn't prove wealth. It only proves that you believe your family's power can stand above the law. Here, that is not true." I handed the card back to the nearest officer, not touching it longer than necessary. Then I said slowly, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, "This court cannot be bought, cannot be threatened, and certainly cannot be controlled by the Morettis. You will answer with the truth, not with arrogance." Valentina stared at me for the first time, her eyes flickering slightly, as if realizing, though not yet accepting, that the door of power she was used to relying on might not open in this room. I signaled the clerk to play the first video, and immediately footage from the traffic camera on Atwells Avenue appeared on the large screen. Valentina's red Ferrari shot into the frame like a fiery arrow, the number 92 miles per hour clearly visible in the corner. Not a slight speeding due to carelessness, but deliberate racing, a declaration that the road belonged to her. Next, we fast-forwarded to the critical moment. Mr. Romano's car was moving legally in the right lane when Valentina suddenly changed lanes, closed in on his side, and steered to force him onto the sidewalk. That image, even seen with the naked eye, was chilling. In this courtroom, it made the air thicken. It couldn't be called an accident. It couldn't be called loss of control. It was an intentional act displaying power, indifferent to another's life. When the video ended, I requested the next footage from Officer Daniels' body cam, the first to arrive at the scene. In the video, Daniels approached the Ferrari, asking Valentina to roll down the window. She ignored him 3 times in a row, then finally lowered it with the attitude of someone granting a favor. Valentina's voice rang out in the courtroom, clear and cold, "You're wasting your time. My father owns this street." When Daniels explained that her actions could lead to charges, Valentina laughed, leaned back in her seat and said, "Do whatever you want. Nothing will happen." When Daniels asked for her vehicle documents, she threw them out the window, letting the papers fall to the ground, then rolled the window back up right in his face. Not a sign of fear, not a bit of cooperation, not a shred of respect for the law. I moved to the medical report, and my voice quieted as I read the notes from Rhode Island Hospital: fractured left clavicle, cracked right hip bone, severe soft tissue injuries, and required multiple days of hospital monitoring. Romano was the economic pillar of his family. His inability to work forced the store to close temporarily, with zero income for many weeks. One thoughtless act by Valentina had pushed an entire family into financial crisis. Then I called the witnesses to the stand. The first one trembled slightly as he approached, admitting that initially he didn't dare provide a statement because that's the Moretti daughter. However, he ultimately showed up because, in his words, "If no one dares to speak, there will be many more people like Mr. Romano." All witnesses confirmed the same thing. Valentina made no attempt to avoid the accident. She intentionally forced the car. One woman recounted hearing Valentina say to her bodyguard, "Teach him a lesson," before Romano's car was forced onto the sidewalk. When the testimony ended, the room fell silent again, not the silence of fear, as before, but stunned at the level of disregard for life they had just clearly seen on the screen. I looked around the room, then said slowly, word by word, "This behavior is not just dangerous, it is a direct threat to community safety, and when someone causes serious injury, yet displays a defiant, contemptuous attitude toward the law, as Miss Moretti has shown in the evidence, the court cannot take it lightly, because if the law cannot protect people like Mr. Romano, then who will we leave in the ranks of those protected?" I looked down at the list of those present in the courtroom, then looked up and called the name that many in this city had avoided mentioning for years. "Mr. Vittorio Moretti, please step forward." The room's atmosphere immediately shifted. No one spoke, no one moved, only a heavy wave spreading, as if the name itself was enough to drop the temperature a few degrees. Vittorio stood from the back row, not hurriedly but without hesitation. He wore a black suit, his face chiseled from stone, his eyes calm to a frightening degree, the look of someone accustomed to living amid power without needing to flaunt it. As he walked to the center of the courtroom, every gaze seemed drawn to the man, a symbol of Providence's darkness, the one police mentioned in low voices and citizens avoided eye contact with on the street. And in that atmosphere, Valentina smiled again, not a smile of remorse or relief, but the smile of someone who thought the rest of the trial was now in her hands. She tilted her head toward her lawyer, whispered something, then glanced at me with an almost triumphant look as if to say, "See, the game is over." Her confidence wasn't pretend, it was built over years from watching her father walk through this city like an uncrowned king where the law sometimes had to step aside just to avoid touching the Moretti name. I saw clearly the absolute belief in her eyes that as soon as her father stepped up, everything would be wiped clean, because throughout her life that's always how things had gone. Vittorio stood at the witness stand, hands clasped, eyes looking straight at me, showing no tension like a father trying to protect his daughter. Valentina leaned forward slightly, waiting for him to speak. I asked if he had anything to present before the court moved to the final evaluation. 1 second passed, then 2. Valentina kept smiling, but when Vittorio opened his mouth, the entire room and her world changed. "Let justice stand," he said, his voice low and gravelly but clear, without tremor, without hesitation. She must answer for what she did. A deadly silence enveloped the room. I had witnessed many defendants collapse, but rarely a moment like this when someone's worldview shattered right before their eyes. Valentina stood frozen. The smile vanished from her lips so quickly it looked like it was yanked away. She frowned, shook her head slightly as if not understanding the words that had come from her father's mouth. "Daddy," she uttered, the sound so small it barely escaped her breath. Vittorio did not turn to look at his daughter. He kept his eyes on me, as if affirming that his decision was not emotional, but something he had considered before entering this courtroom. "She is your daughter," I said, not to challenge but to confirm his intent. "Yes," Vittorio replied. "And precisely because of that, today I will no longer shield her." Valentina nearly let out a gasp of horror. I watched her, seeing clearly that she was trying to find another explanation. Perhaps he misspoke, or he was acting to appease the law. But when Vittorio turned to look at his daughter, his eyes no longer carried the power of a king of darkness. Instead, they were the eyes of a man who had watched his child become a distorted product of the power he had created. "Enough, Valentina," he said quietly but loud enough for the whole room to hear. "This time you face this on your own." That was like the final blow to the wall of privilege Valentina had always leaned on. She stepped back, hands gripping the edge of the table tightly, her face drained of all color. She was no longer the arrogant woman who had entered the courtroom that morning, but someone who had just realized that, for the first time in her life, the Moretti family power would no longer clear the way for her. The entire courtroom remained dead silent, but this silence was not out of fear of Vittorio. It was because they had just witnessed something many in Providence thought would never happen, the dark power voluntarily stepping back. And in that moment the law, simple, stark, unadorned, stood tall, higher than any family name that could threaten it. I let the courtroom stay silent a little longer before turning back to the file in front of me, because I knew everyone here, including Valentina, needed time to understand that the collapse of privilege was not the end, but only the beginning of accountability. When I read the sentence, my voice was not loud but clear, each word falling like unchangeable milestones. For the charge of reckless endangerment, I sentence you to 18 months in prison. For the charges of intimidation and obstruction, related to threatening a witness and obstructing police, I sentence you to an additional 2 years in prison. Upon completion of your prison term, you will undergo 6 months of mandatory probation under strict supervision. Additionally, you must complete 1,500 hours of community service in programs supporting victims affected by gang violence, people who once lived in fear under the shadow of your family. And finally, for the next 5 years from today, you are prohibited from any contact, direct or indirect, with any member of the Moretti family. Each sentence, each penalty, made Valentina's face twitch slightly, but not from physical pain. It was because she understood that for the first time in her life, her future was no longer in the hands of the family she had once believed was untouchable. When I asked Mr. Romano if he wished to say anything before the court adjourned, he stood up, limping slightly but with bright eyes. He did not look at Valentina with hatred. Instead, he looked like someone who had witnessed too much injustice and only hoped this would be a turning point for change. "Your Honor," he said slowly, "I don't want revenge. I just want to live in a city where people like me don't have to bow their heads to anyone, where the law stands on the side of those who have nothing but hard work and kindness." His words brought a different kind of silence to the courtroom, not heavy with fear but with the simple, profound sincerity that everyone could feel. I nodded, recording his statement in the record, then declared the session adjourned. But the story did not end there. Many months after the sentence was carried out, reports from the Department of Corrections sent to my office indicated that Valentina was no longer involved in any activities related to the Moretti family. In fact, she had been completely cut off from all circles of power by her own family, as if they wanted to amputate a limb that had exposed the body. Instead of reacting with anger, Valentina did something few had predicted. She volunteered for a program supporting at-risk youth in South Providence, kids who were vulnerable to being pulled into the path she once thought was her destiny. I heard that she spent many afternoons just listening to the kids talk about their fears, about growing up in the shadows and longing to escape them. One day my office received a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from Valentina, unadorned, with no excuses. She simply wrote, "I cannot change what I did, but I am trying to become someone Mr. Romano could forgive or at least no longer have to fear." Enclosed was a separate letter addressed to Mr. Romano in which she admitted her fault and pledged to use the rest of her life to make amends. I sat for a long time after reading the letter. Finally, I wrote in my work journal, a habit I've kept for many years, a simple line: justice is not just punishment. Justice is a door, and sometimes when that door opens at the right moment, people have the chance to step through and become something better than they ever imagined. The story of Valentina Moretti reflects a reality that still exists in American life today, the power gap and the mistaken belief that wealth or family influence can stand above the law. Valentina, driving 92 miles per hour on Atwells Avenue, deliberately forcing Mr. Romano's car onto the sidewalk and saying, "My father owns this street," is an exaggerated but not distant image of what we still see. Power sometimes creates the illusion that dangerous or irresponsible behavior can be overlooked. Her arrogant statement, "I don't spend under $100K a day, that's your yearly salary," highlights the disconnect from reality when some people born into privilege no longer see the value of labor, community, or the ordinary people around them. However, the collapse of privilege in the story, when Vittorio Moretti himself said, "Let justice stand," reminds us that even in a complex society like the United States, where inequality and hidden power sometimes make citizens skeptical, justice can still prevail if the community and its institutions protect it. The important lesson here is not only for those who hold power but for all of us. Personal responsibility is something that cannot be bought with money and cannot be passed on to others. Romano, despite serious injuries and financial loss, chose to speak the truth without hatred. This reflects the spirit of many communities in the United States. People who still believe in the law and kindness even in the face of injustice. Valentina, after losing her privilege and facing consequences, ultimately chose the path of redemption, showing that change is real when people are confronted with the mirror of their own actions. In a society where pressures, temptations, and power disparities still exist, we can learn from this story that respect, responsibility, and humility not only save others but also save us from becoming the worst version of ourselves. Thank you for joining me on this journey in search of justice today. If this story touched something in your thoughts, please subscribe to the channel to continue exploring with me the real lessons from the courtroom. See you in the next video, where we will continue to uncover stories that remind us that in the United States, justice only has meaning when we all protect it together.